Today's program of the Marin Chapter of the World Affairs Council of Northern California. I'm Paul Clark, a member of the steering committee, and I will be your host for a presentation on strategic fog, U.S. military operations in the 21st century with Professor James Russell. But before we begin, we have a few notices. First, I'd like you to know about our next program, which will be on Tuesday, November 17th. Featuring the scholar Andrew Reddy of Livermore National Laboratories and UC Berkeley. And Dr. Reddy will speak on the future of arms control, if there is one. He will describe the mounting danger created by the expiration of most of our international treaties intended to curb the number and spread of nuclear weapons. As many of you know, the World Affairs Council of Northern California puts on scores of really high quality programs each year. And if you like these programs, we invite you to go to the website and become a member or donate or do both. That website is www.worldaffairs.org. And by the way, on that same website, in a few days, a recording of this presentation will be available. And you can share that with anyone you'd like to see the good programming done by this organization. The format of this event is about 30 minutes or so presentation followed by your questions. Unfortunately, the way it works is the audience is muted throughout the process, but you can submit questions. And if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen on the right, there's a button that says Q&A, and you can pop in questions and I will field those questions for you. So let's begin our program. Dr. James Russell is an associate professor in the Department of National Security Affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey. And there he teaches courses on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, military innovation, and national security strategy. And his articles and commentaries have appeared in a wide variety of media and scholarly outlets, including on the topic of which he's going to speak today. From 1988 to 2001, Dr. Russell held a variety of positions in the Office of Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. And during this period, he traveled extensively in the Persian Gulf and the broader Middle East, working on U.S. security policies. We'd like you to know that the views of Professor Russell are his personal opinions, don't reflect on the views of the Naval Postgraduate School, Department of the Navy, or Department of Defense. It's a boilerplate statement we need to make. They're his views, and I think they're very interesting views. And in fact, Dr. Russell spoke to our committee in 2017 about Saudi Arabia, which turned out to be a very timely topic. And I think you'll find that his observations today on another apt issue, and he simply poses and answers the question, what has our military achieved through its far-reaching and protracted counter-terrorism campaign since 9/11? So without further ado, please welcome back to our virtual podium, Professor James Russell. Dr. Russell.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Paul, for that introduction. What I'll do with your leave is I will put the screen share on and pull up some slides that I'll try to walk through quickly within the half-hour, sort of period, and then look forward to having. I guess I'm not going to have a conversation with people, but I can certainly deal with people's questions. So let me see if I can get the screen share going here, and. Let's see. Is everybody seeing this? You seeing it, Paul?
Yes, it looks good.
Okay. All right. So the title of this talk is "The Dawn of War and America's Strategic Fog." So as indicated by Paul, I sort of have to say this in every talk that I give outside the classroom, that I'm not speaking for the postgraduate school or the Navy or the Department of Defense or the US government. These are my opinions only. So in addressing this topic, so to speak, it's really a summary of I don't know, observations, insights, perspectives that I've sort of built over 30 plus years working as a civilian in the Defense Department. And before that, of course, in the 80s, also worked as a journalist for 4 years, again, dealing with the Department of Defense as an outsider. So I've been working in and around our military institutions as a civilian basically since the sort of mid-1980s, which of course dates me, means that I'm old, getting older. So anyway, so my interest or my offering up of my views on the topic as outlined here in the title basically resulted from the assassination by, it was the, I don't know how else to describe it, when you fired a missile at somebody and you blow him up and all the people around him without warning, so to speak. It was the killing of the IRGC commander Qasem Soleimani, who was the head of the Revolutionary Guard. This was in Iraq, in Baghdad in January 2020. And predictably, of course, you know, as has happened or has happened with some frequency over the last sort of 15, 20 odd years now, we kill these people, and there's great public fanfare, and we sort of talk about, oh, you know, isn't this a good thing? You know, he was such a bad guy, and which is true, of course. But we sort of treat this sort of event as some kind of, you know, strategic accomplishment. It's going to achieve something very concrete, you know, for the United States. And so I find those sorts of reactions is to be really very sort of irritating, frankly, and misguided. And hence I sort of come up with this sort of metaphor of the strategic fog. In which I apply to sort of the post 9/11 circumstances, in which we've been sort of broadly engaged across South Asia, by which I mean the Middle East, Afghanistan, and in which we have been engaged in wars, and we've sent our land forces to these places that have achieved no strategic purpose and for which there is no sensible end. Right? There's no end. I mean, it's called the forever war because it seems as if it goes on forever. Then Secretary of Mattis, of course, referred to this as quote unquote strategic atrophy, in which he refers to this period of irregular war, the war on terror, call it whatever you want, this phenomenon that unfolds after 9/11, right? So my question is, in seeking to address in this presentation is, you know, how did we end up in this place exactly? You know, where we trumpet things like the assassination of the IRGC commander as some kind of great accomplishment, and you know, what are the broader sort of objectives that we're trying to achieve, and so my sort of point here is, or my objective is to sort of, in coming up with this formulation, is to really answer this sort of question, is that how can we restore sort of, I don't know, some semblance of rationality to the sort of objectives of using force, which I think, at least in the best of all possible worlds, should be used to seek and preserve a peaceful global order. We should not seek to be engaged in wars that have no sort of end, and we shouldn't just be killing people because we think they're bad people. We should be using force, using the tools at our disposal to achieve a broader sort of broader objectives, peaceful objectives, in my view. So how did we get here in this place, if you will? So this is not something that appears overnight. Okay, so which is to say, it's not just that something bad happens on 9/11, although that is certainly part of this sort of phenomenon, that you can't sort of separate somehow the approach of the United States in this war on terror from the 9/11 attacks. It's certainly the case that there, you know, were dark views of the world before them and these sort of pronouncements of the chaotic international system. But it is the case, certainly, that after the 9/11 attacks, there is this sort of momentum towards a worldview, if you will, that the event itself augurs in a new and much more dangerous era for the world, in which small groups of terrorists and basements threaten the stability of the entire international system, right? These empowered, globalized terrorist groups with mass destructive weapons represent this kind of existential threat, okay? And they're more powerful than states. And this becomes the pretext, of course, for an even more militarized foreign policy in the Middle East. And when I say even more, I do mean even more, because our foreign policy in the Middle East has been militarized for the better part of 30 to 40 years. There isn't a way to say that it hasn't. And of course, the problem, of course, is that this militarized foreign policy, the sending of our armies. You know, our armies have been in Iraq, you know, twice now in the last 20 years, have had disastrous second-order effects, arguably much more serious than and far-reaching than the problems that the deployments of these land forces was designed to address. Right. So we've got these broken states in Syria, Iraq, Libya, Yemen. Millions of people in refugee camps and displaced populations numbering in the millions. You know, the statistics, for example, in Syria of the results of the civil war there, dramatic reductions, for example, in the life expectancy of males in Syria over the last, sort of 7 to 10 years. Tens of thousands of innocent civilians have been killed. And of course, the blowback, from these military campaigns basically continues. Most notably, of course, in Western Europe, continues to this day, dramatically, of course, affecting the politics of the Western European states. The picture on the right is she was then secretary, at the time, she was the National Security Advisor. And there is this, of course, moment in 2003 when she gets herself in front of the TV and warns the American public of impending mushroom clouds, right, as the justification for what is then going to become the American invasion of Iraq, which follows, of course, on the heels of the American invasion of Afghanistan. I should hasten to add that I put those two wars in different categories. It seems to me that the international community is behind the United States in the invasion of Afghanistan, and the United States, of course, misses this critical opportunity to really build a truly global coalition that could potentially have outlawed all state support for international terrorism, right? Following the invasion of Afghanistan. But the story is told, we invade Iraq, as I said, afterwards, to great sort of strategic sort of disaster. So the sources of the fog, right, that sort of that envelop us, after 9/11. And I'm just sort of boiling this down to what I think of as a bunch of maybe 3 or 4 sort of points as to how this fog arises and what are the main characteristics here. The first one I sort of point to is the loss of strategic patience, right, and the belief that time's on our side. So this sort of frittering away, if you will, of this strategic patience has become a hallmark of American sort of strategy today, which is it's a very dangerous sort of thing. And it's been abandoned for what I can see is to real no good use, which is to say that we are, relatively speaking, by most statistical indicators, as strong economically as we have been relative to other global actors. The country faces no real external threat today to its safety. And the formulation of George Kennan, for example, in the Cold War, he provides this formulation in his Mr. X article, in which he sort of lays out what he believes to be the correct approach to the Soviet Union, the confrontation, which he sees, of course, before others, that it's coming. In which he argues essentially that the internal contradictions of communism are going to prove its undoing, and that time is on our side, right? That we in the West, with capitalism and with political transparency and democracy, we're going to continue to grow and be stronger over time, the Soviets are going to get weaker, which of course is exactly what's happened. And I see that in the sort of the era of today, Kennan's formulation has been largely abandoned, and I think, which is a terrible thing. Okay, and it's basically been replaced by this idea of preventative war, right? Which is this idea that, again, these terrorist groups, dictators are sort of, assembling these dangerous weapons, out of our view, and we have to go get them earlier rather than later, attack them while they're weak, attack them, before the costs will get too high, so to speak. So after 9/11, it's the preventative war model, sort of, and the abandonment of strategic patience. Again, it's one of the sort of phenomenon, as I say, that emerges. The source of the fog, too, I would say, is threat inflation. Now, threat inflation is of course, it's an industry, of course, in Washington, D.C. for those who pay close attention to this. And it certainly recalls earlier Cold War arguments about the nature of the Soviet threat, and disagreements, profound disagreements in the American political constellation about the nature of the threat, right? So in the 1980s, for example, the neoconservatives and two prominent members of the neoconservative strand of strategic thought, if you will, Richard Perle and Paul Wolfowitz. There were arguments in the 1980s at the outset of the Reagan administration that were pushed by Perle, for example, and Wolfowitz, and a whole group of neoconservatives, that the Democrats had, of course, sold the country down the river. They had been dramatically, underestimated the Soviet threat. They had dramatically underestimated Soviet military spending. And there's the formation, of course, of these quote unquote red teams, which look at the intelligence provided by the CIA. They conclude that the CIA is mistaken, and that Reagan uses the findings, for example, of this exercise, the red team exercises in the early 1980s, to do what? To basically dramatically increase American military spending, and basically sign on to the assessments of this group. And it has to be said, of course, that this group, the neoconservatives, they regarded people like Nixon and Henry Kissinger as traitors. They were not in agreement with the idea that we should be negotiating arms control agreements with the Soviets, that they were inimically opposed to the American way of life, and they were untrustworthy and they're bad people, all this sort of thing. So the interesting sort of footnote to that, of course, is that in the Reagan administration, there was adult supervision, over these people. You had Caspar Weinberger running the Defense Department. You had George Shultz running the State Department. And the president, of course, he was maybe one of the last presidents that had really empowered his cabinet secretaries and, to take responsibility. And they basically kept the neoconservatives, in check, of course. And so what happens in the 1980s, history has forgotten, of course, that the neoconservatives were wrong about the Soviet Union. They were rotting from within, just as Kennan had said they would. There was evidence to suggest that they were rotting, and the evidence was pushed aside in favor of the more sort of dramatic assessments of Soviet strength. So you fast forward to Bush Jr. Assuming power, and the neocons return to sort of prominence, making the same arguments, if you will, but transplanting those arguments to the circumstances of today, with the problem being is that they don't have adult supervision, and they have an inexperienced president, for example, who is, understandably traumatized by the 9/11 attacks. And of course, it opens the door towards the portrayal again of the Islamic extremists as this existential threat to the republic, something that they never in our wildest imaginations really were, right? And of course, the focus on Islamic extremism, which is, of course, it's not a good thing. I'm not saying this is this isn't a bad thing, of course, but that it's had remarkable staying power. And ISIS, for example, is the sort of the latest iteration of this, and it's actually provided as the sort of case for why we in the United States need to keep on policing this Middle East. It's ISIS, you know. And just as the footnote, you know, most of these Sunni extremists, you know, for example, they actually come from countries that are supposed to be our allies, right? I mean, okay, that's a footnote. Disaffected Saudis, disaffected Jordanians, for example. So sources of fog 2. Sources of fog 3. Another of the sort of characteristics of the era is what I call the inverted levels of war, right? In which in the 9/11 era, we start mistaking clever tactics for strategy. We come to believe that counterinsurgency, for example, is a strategy as opposed to a set of tactics and procedures that you undertake at the tactical level to fight in guerrilla wars, right? And we venerate, of course, the practitioners of counterinsurgency as being these sort of, you know, heroic-like figures, like General Petraeus, for example, who was looked upon as being and General McChrystal. And these guys are, of course, still wandering around the country for six-figure speaking fees, telling us about all the great things they accomplished in these places. It's really sort of offensive, at least to me, anyway. So, but anyway, the idea here is that in another source of the fog is that we lose this connection between strategic objectives and the role that military institutions and force are supposed to play in achieving those objectives. In other words, the objectives is not, you know, Soleimani, the assassination of Soleimani is the example. So what is the objective in killing a Soleimani exactly? How does that affect, you know, the American relationship and the competition with Iran? What is the means to the end? And instead we get drawn down into this sort of, again, this tactical sort of a look at, you know, believing, for example, that war is seen as this engineering and targeting problem and divorced from politics. And we see Soleimani, so we should just kill him because, you know, we can, which of course is another function of the drone, you know, sort of campaigns, the drone strikes that have been going on now for what, the last 10 to 15 years. And the other thing, of course, is that another in this inversion process is that we start believing our own press releases about how good we actually are, right? And so we characterize ourselves as having this full spectrum dominance, and it's, I mean, there's a whole vernacular, you know, that gets sort of adopted, you know, in this era about our capabilities, which are sort of significant. I'm not saying they're not, but we start believing them ourselves, which is the problem, this full spectrum dominance, when the contradictions of our dominance are sort of slapping us in the face on a daily basis in places like Iraq and Afghanistan in guerrilla wars. So the last of the sort of sources of the fog, as I see it, is we lose our ability to adapt and change and to drop things that aren't working, right? So basically, I see that the failures of military operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. So we can say that we sent into our military to these places with poor strategic direction, and we turned over these grand social and political engineering projects to company commanders, battalion commanders, brigade commanders, and while they also had to fight an insurgency, difficult, very difficult problem, of course, but they didn't succeed. There isn't a way to say that they did. And our leaders, our senior military and political leaders, never got themselves on TV. Obama never did it, never got himself on TV and said, you know, this just isn't working. You know, we need to get out, you know, we need to stop this. You know, we need to stop re-engineering these societies at the point of a gun. It's not going to work. And another example, the Carter Doctrine, this commitment to police the Gulf and the Middle East. The evidence is overwhelming that we need to abandon this, right? What are we still doing there in the aftermath of these 20 years of failed operations? To say nothing of the sort of unsavory partners that we all find ourselves in bed with over there. Saudi Arabia, this is a country that has chopped up this guy Jamal Khashoggi in the embassy in, you know, in Turkey. Egypt, the Security Sector Corporation, Turkey, they've thrown all the press in jail. And the Israelis, of course, how many millions of Palestinians of the Israelis are holding at gunpoint and are apparently prepared to do so sort of indefinitely, right? And also framing this issue, I think, is also in terms of the Middle East and this Carter Doctrine. The fact of the matter is the Middle East just isn't that important to the United States anymore, and we should leave the job of policing the place to the countries themselves, which is actually sort of already happening anyway. So, how do you explain this? How did we end up at this place, or these sources of this fog? And the observations I would make, and they are just observations, is that the descent in the capacity to think about the world it mirrors the descent of the political thought at home, right? In other words, as we became confused about the world, we became confused at home. The Republican Party, I think they bear a lot of responsibility for this. They declare war on the government in the 1990s, and scorched earth becomes the approach. I get so tired of hearing about these talks of polarization. It's one of the parties it's a political party that has essentially refused, right, to conduct itself in anything approaching a constructive sort of dialogue, right, about how you govern. And so what happens, one of the results of this is that the centrist consensus of Republicans, Democrats that help guide foreign policy, that disappears. Then you have the liberal internationalists on the Democrats who overlap with the neocons, who want to use force for moral purposes. This is you see this in Afghanistan, for example. We invade Afghanistan in November of 2001. And by January of 2002, we already have testimony on the Hill about, the reason why we're in Afghanistan is to ensure women's rights. We need to ensure that the women are able to go to schools and they're able to do these things. In other words, it helps lead to this mission creep that gets dumped into the laps of military forces. We also have the divorce of the public from our military institutions, and we've outsourced our soldiering to the Praetorian elite, so the public sort of averts its gaze, and we construct these frankly stupid narratives about, we wrap our soldiers in yellow ribbons, and the people should be in the streets demanding answers about why their youngsters have been sent off to these places to be killed, basically, and wounded and maimed and returned home with all these sort of problems. And then, of course, the political leaders who have had this tendency to sort of present that all the wars, these wars of the post 9/11, they're all supposed to be short, they're low cost, and they're financed with bonds bought by the Chinese and the Arabs. We don't have to pay for them, which is, of course, again, an absurd, and have been proven to be wrong, of course. So the steps to restore clarity. I'll conclude here. The first of these is to, I'm not arguing here or not saying that Trump has been anything other than a complete and utter disaster and a threat to democracy, of course, at home. He's actually right about some of his initial ideas on foreign policy, which is to sort of look at our overseas commitments, try to figure out which of these makes sense. Should we be deployed in all these countries? Should we be fighting these endless wars? Should we have the same kind of relationship with the Europeans? We should stop seriously to think about these things, right? We stop reflexively reaching for the holster. And also, by the way, we should stop shredding international norms and laws, these norms and laws that we, of course, have helped put in place. So I'm basically suggesting here that you introduce some sort of order to a planning process that looks at the importance of allies, the historic allies. You don't dispense with your allies lightly. And even if the sort of relationship between the Europeans and the Americans, for example, is going to be different, we should remain in partnership with them. The Australians, the Europeans, the Canadians, these are all people that have been needlessly alienated by the Trump administration. We also have to hope that the Republicans return from the abyss, which I say that they've fallen into, basically, to help restore some kind of centrist consensus in foreign policy. But I think it's unlikely at this point. You look at the people that are being elected, or running for office, and it's not encouraging. I see another manifestation is this of the fog, which still shrouds us, is this hysteria about a coming confrontation with China, and the Department of Defense is producing these reports reminiscent of the Soviet military power reports of the 1980s. And reality is that I can't think of a scenario under which we in the United States would want to go to war against a country with 1 billion people. I mean, it's just a bad idea, right? Ask the Japanese, how did the Sino-Japanese War turn out for the Japanese? I mean, this is really, if we think invading Iraq or trying to, police Iraq and Afghanistan was a bad idea, can you imagine what the experience would be against the Chinese? I mean, really, unbelievable. And so I'll just conclude by saying that the idea here is that I think we try to get back to we try to address the sources of the fog. We try to restore strategic patience. We stop at threat inflation, articulate strategic objectives and reasonable means to achieve them. Admit that you're wrong and change course accordingly as called for by circumstance. So those are my concluding thoughts, and I will await your comments and questions.
Oh, thank you very much, Professor James Russell, for your comments. And we have folks dropping in questions already. So again, if you'd like to make a question to Professor Russell, if you could look to the bottom of your screen on the bottom right, there's a button that says Q&A, and there's a few entries already. So I'd like to get started with them. Professor, if you're ready.
Yes.
Got 2 questions from Steve Alter regarding how we determine funding, how much we should spend, and how we should allocate them. I'm going to read them because I think they're well written. Yeah. So the first one is from Steve Alter. From a strategic viewpoint, in terms of national welfare, how much should the U.S. spend on the military? Mm-hmm. And then he says, thinking about specific spending levels, 100% of the current level, 80%, and then how would you allocate to categories such as troops, submarines, nukes, cyber, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, it's a great question because it actually flows from this idea of threat inflation, strategic patience. And, this is an age-old question is, what kind of force do you actually need to promote your interests in the strategic environment? And of course, this is wrapped up, the answer to the question, of course, is wrapped up in this sort of vision of what is the American role in the world? Is it to protect and preserve the liberal international order? And do we need a force that should be capable of going out there to police the international order and to police the system to keep it operating in ways that are redound to America's benefit? So that's on the one hand. The other side of this says, and this is the argument that is now, Robert Kagan would be an example of a person who argues for the expansive, the $700 billion defense budget, right? Which is what we're about where we are. Maybe it's a little bit less, depending on if you count overseas contingency funds. The opposite side is we should go more to a posture of offshore balancing, where we we encourage, right, coalition partners to police areas of the world themselves, and we offer them training, assistance, we do security cooperation, but we don't have a force which can necessarily be structured to go there and stay there for extended periods of time. The Middle Eastern infrastructure is a good sort of example. Do we need the air bases in the Combined Air Operations Center, for example, of Al Udeid, which is in Qatar? Do we need pre-positioned military equipment over there? Do we need all these things? So part of the answer to the question is it depends upon your view of the strategic environment. In my opinion, being that we are now in the pandemic, sort of this period of the pandemic where we're having to print money to stop people from starving. And the truth of the matter is we can't even agree on how much money to print for people. There's the Republicans, for example, don't think we should be doing that anymore. I guess they're ready to let people starve. I don't know. But the point is I guess that the defense budget is going to get smaller. It just is. It's at unsustainably high levels. And this will force us to make difficult choices, which the interesting thing about the Defense Department budget is, of course, we basically divide that budget up by a third, which is to say Army, Navy, and Air Force. And you add Special Forces in now because they're now basically their own military arm at this point. So the question sort of is, how do you alter that mix? Should the Navy get bigger? Should the Army be bigger? And what about the Marines? Do you offer some sort of consolidation, integration, for example, of the land forces as one sort of potential to sort of reduce this? I think the change that the budget levels your questioner refers to, it's going to be forced upon us, right? And it's going to demand that political leaders make hard choices about reducing those costs. Like a case study of today is the United States Navy, for example, which sees itself as returning to prominence after the 20 years of land wars, as just as they have signed up to a shipbuilding program which envisions untold billions of additional dollars flowing into the Navy accounts to pay for additional ships, right? So we don't get there from here, right? In other words, in terms of the force structure that the system produces for the civilian decision makers to look at. And my answer to the question is, circumstances are going to force us to contract and go to a smaller budget. My own sort of opinion is the budget could be, the armed forces could be cut by a third and should be cut by a third. And would be perfectly capable of performing most of the most important missions. I've been in the DoD system too long. I think that's the truth of the matter, and I see the the waste, sort of, so to speak, the redundancy that's been created over decades. So, long-winded answer.
No, that's good. That was very good. I have a question from Mark, and same question occurred to me. You mentioned a few names in there that have made a lot of impact on our policy, Pearl and Wolfowitz and Condoleezza Rice. And he says, we're supposed to have the brightest minds, a familiar term, making strategic decisions in foreign policy. Assuming we do, in fact, have smart people, where's the disconnection? Looking beyond the sources of the fog, right. Discuss, you have, why are we getting the low grade strategic thinking, and how are we getting into these positions?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I should hasten to add that the current group, surrounding Trump in the national security domain is, for all practical purposes, non-existent. In other words, there isn't anybody, as far as I can see, in the Trump, sort of national security strategy sort of mix that's offering that is really any part of the sort of an intellectual elite, if you will, the best and the brightest, that's supposed to be offering up and packaging up these options. What I would say is that it gets to this issue of where does the talent come from, right? Where do the communities come from that the people in the executive branch can draw upon to provide them with these sources of advice? And one of the characteristics, I call it the marketplace of ideas, right, in the United States over the last quarter-odd century. In the 1960s, and I'm referring to the 60s not because things were so great in the 1960s. Not the case. That we did lots of stupid things in the 1960s, but that marketplace of ideas was primarily driven in the academy, right, in academics, and there was the leading sort of the Rand Corporation gets formed, and there is a sort of a creation of these linkages between think tanks and the academy. Today, however, you don't have the academy really, by which I mean academics, really included in this community anymore. It's the talent pool is essentially managed by ideologically inclined institutions which are masquerading as these quote unquote think tanks. They call themselves think tanks. So all of the neocons, for example, they go to the American Enterprise Institute when they're not in power, and they go there and they sit in their offices at the American Enterprise Institute pulling in their salaries, waiting for the Republicans to get back in. And it's, in other words, these are like-minded, ideologically like-minded people, right? Now, sort of, if you go around the horn in Washington, D.C., and you look at another example is the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. This is the Israeli lobby, right? So you have, Dennis Ross is like the example. He's been this guy who's been in the middle of American, unsuccessful American sort of policy for the better part of 2 decades. And he's flitted back and forth across the aisle from the Washington Institute into the executive branch over the course of his career, a distinguished career, I might add. The problem is, again, that in this marketplace of ideas, it's become increasingly to be dominated by these think tanks in DC who have ideologically inclined agendas, right? They are not necessarily full of the best and the brightest people who are looking at the evidence, coming up with solutions. They are themselves and they are, of course, in these institutes primarily because of their ideological, sort of fervor. The Cato Institute, another example, right? Of again, so that's how I would answer that. Is that the talent pool, I guess to summarize, is being managed by institutes which are more ideologically inclined, right, and aren't actually doing. I don't think of them as doing, important, sort of theoretical, empirically based research, which what you should want in government. You want solutions based on evidence. What does the evidence suggest? What are the solutions to the problems that you're having? In other words, you have people arriving in their jobs with the answers already decided based in part on their political philosophy, their political ideology. Yeah.
That's the grand strategy versus bland strategy that we get now. It's not to put you on the spot, but is there a strategic thinker out there that you like our listeners to be aware of? That someone you like?
Sure. So one of there's a couple of people that I am fans of. I'm a big fan of Steve Walt at Harvard, who writes for foreign policy. I mean, he writes for a lot of. He's written bunches of books, and he writes longer pieces. But his more approachable. I don't want to say it's more approachable. His pieces dealing with the sort of current circumstance. He writes a piece every 2 weeks for foreign policy. You got to have a subscription to be able to read it. Unfortunately, you get 2 free articles a month or something. And Steve is he's from the quote unquote realist camp, right? Which is the realist camp of international relations, which kind of looks at the international system and looks at the United States position in the international system from a pretty sort of basic perspective, like what are the costs and what are the benefits of certain courses of action. Tries not to be ideological. So I'm a big fan of Walt's stuff. I'm also a big fan of Andrew Bacevich. I'm right now I'm teaching my course in U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, and I'm having my students read Bacevich's book, which is about America's greater war for the Middle East, which attempts to place the American involvement in the Middle East and the wars of the last 20 odd years in a broader strategic context, which of course is absolutely right. And someone who haven't participated in some of this stuff, you see the linkages of that Bacevich is able to draw across the sort of the span of decades. And I think the Bacevich is again is another like Walt, and I guess we are all drawn to these commentators that we agree with intrinsically. Basically argues for a more restrained, less militarized, sort of foreign policy, which I am also a fan of, I guess. Barry Posen, another one, he's at MIT. Another of the commentators. I find myself in the realist sort of camp, I guess, if you will, of which is if I get back to my previous questions, the realists don't really have a think tank because they're not ideological and they haven't attracted the money, right, from donors to be able to organize themselves as unlike some of the other think tanks, as I said. So.
Great, and much misunderstood, I think, during the Bush era. I have some other questions. So Lewis asks, "Hey, I'm on board with your statements, but now what? We're in so deep. How do we get out without messing everything up?"
Yeah. So this is also has been a persistent conundrum in American strategy and foreign policy, and this goes back. This is not something of the last 15 years, 20 years.
Hmm.
It was the sort of problem of Vietnam, right? Well, when do we? How do we? How do we get out? How do we walk away from this? This commitment of blood and treasure, propping up the South Vietnamese government, building the army of the Republic of Vietnam. Fast forward today, to again our failed attempts, to build these, re-engineer these societies in places like Iraq and Afghanistan being the two latest examples, unsuccessful attempts of us to try to re-engineer these places. And the answer is that you have to be willing, as I said, you've got to be willing to sort of say and acknowledge failure and say this isn't working. And of course, one of the persistent, sort of arguments that you hear made, this was the case in Vietnam, it's the case now, which is that, oh, we can't retreat because American credibility will be damaged, and the countries and our allies won't take us seriously anymore. Therefore, ... we must stay, right? And this is the most popularly sort of cited reason that, oh, well, we can't leave because it's this. Let me tell you, for your assembled audience, whenever you hear any observer talking about American credibility is the reason to sort of do or not do something, you should grab onto your wallet, right? Because there's cash that's being lifted out of it. And it is the worst and most stupid reason that you could ever imagine, hearing that, oh, well, this is because of American credibility and we can't do this because our credibility is going to be damaged. It's nonsense, right? And there's been actual academic work done on this, with the most frequently cited case, of course, of Munich. This is the favorite rallying cry of the neocons: no more Munichs, and this was the idea, of course, that it was the perceptions of Allied weakness at Munich that encouraged Hitler to take a more militarized approach, and blah blah blah. And that we have, and if the British and the French had just been strong, they would have stopped Hitler at Munich. And this is the familiar. It's the rallying cry. And the academic research on this just pokes all sorts of holes in this. It's Hitler. Hitler figured that the balance of forces, the correlation of forces, had shifted in his direction, and he was a very astute, again, at least at that point, a realist-oriented guy. So the point is, the answer to the question is, you have to acknowledge that you failed, and you have to get out. There's no other way to do it cleanly, and I frankly, I have sympathy with Trump's, sort of on this. Like, we should be getting out of Iraq. We have no more business being in Iraq. The place has been turned into a vassal Iranian state, that's corrupt to the core. The New York Times did a wonderful series of essays about what's happened inside Iraq over the last 4 years, and the whole bloody place is being run by a bunch of kleptocracy militias, with Iranian, indirect control. And it's no different in Afghanistan. The Afghans were masters at taking our money, basically. And it's time we have to walk away. And there isn't a pretty way to do it. I mean, you don't want to, for God's sakes, you don't want to have the helicopters taking off from the embassy with people grabbing onto them, as was the case in South Vietnam. But there isn't a pretty way to disengage from mistakes, right? And you just have to do it, right?
Well, that's great. Well, of course, that was in April '75, and by the time, and we had a lot going on then, Watergate and all sorts of things, and then President Reagan simply turned the clock back and started growing the military again. Right. So we do survive those things. I mean, make a very good point.
Of course we do. Yeah.
Yeah. So Frank Rettenberg, our chairperson of our steering committee, has got a question, and he observes, and I think you suggested this too, that we have a lot of area experts, but they seem to be and regional experts who are kind of separated a bit too much from our political leadership, and their advice is swept under the rug sometimes, more so than than in the past. And he gives the example of Doug Feith over at and DoD creating his own intelligence agency, essentially, because he didn't like what the CIA was giving him.
Yep.
What's your viewpoint on that?
Well, my viewpoint is that, again, this sort of gets back to the earlier question about the best and the brightest. You know, what's happened to the best and the brightest? Where are these people? And so, as Frank would well know, I can only speak from my own limited experience as a civilian in the office of the Secretary of Defense, is that the idea used to be was that the best and the brightest were the professional staff, right? The idea was that these organizations, and I worked in the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. This was again in the 90s, there's maybe 250 people in this overall organization. We're advising the Secretary of Defense on a whole range of policy. It's basically the Defense Department's version of the State Department to a certain extent. You have regional expertise, you have functional expertise, et cetera, et cetera. But the point is that best and brightest, right? The people in the organization are there because of a personnel policy that gets built and developed to try to attract people from the graduate programs around the country that are coming out of the international relations schools, for example. And you're building this sort of corpus of resident expertise, right? That provides continuity to the leadership, which after all is changing on a pretty continuous basis, right? So the idea is you're building the expertise in places like in the acquisition world and the program analysis and evaluation in the regions. And that the idea being that, again, the presidents come and go, the parties change, the professional staff stays the same. The professional staff, is the continuity. It can provide the information to up the hierarchy to arrive at decisions or support decision making. So this has changed, kind of dramatically, as Frank sort of notes, in which I was just at the very end of this era in the civilian staff that on my way out the door, so to speak, when I exit, in 2001, the people coming in behind me are from the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. They're from the American Enterprise Institute. They are, again, they're political people whose expertise has gotten them to the jobs because of their political ideologies and their connections to people like Doug Feith, for example, who brings in his whole coterie of people. So over the last sort of 20 odd years, the professional staffs have been whittled away, if you will, and they have been politicized, which I think is a great mistake. I'm less familiar about what's happened at the State Department, because again, the idea there is that the Foreign Service officers, they cycle out into the embassies, they get the experience, and they go back, and they are part of this system, generating information, pulling information from the field, funneling it up to the leadership. I don't know. I'm less familiar with that, but I can say, just again, based on my idea from in the Defense Department, that yes, the regional experts are devalued. And it's one of the reasons I did not want to go back to the Pentagon, which was because Bill Ludi was running our old office, and he was, he regarded us all as traitors, when he showed up to take over our old office in Near East South Asian affairs. And it was obvious to me, and it was obvious to a bunch of us, that bad things were going to happen to us in Iraq, in Iraq in particular. And that he didn't want to hear anything from us, about the potential problems. He did not want us to tell him of the difficulties that were going to arise. I recall in just one sort of small story, I was called up into Doug Feith's office, and Richard Pearl is sitting there, and they looked at me and they said, well, we want to have a no-fly zone over Iraq 365 days a year. And we want to be patrolling, because we just had this limited coverage in these no-fly zones. And so I walked through this sort of 10 or 15 minute scenario, how the no-fly zones were great political tools, but to operationalize them required, pretty significant sort of heavy lifting by the coalition partners, by Turkey, by Bahrain, by Saudi Arabia, by Kuwait, all these places were basing these airplanes. And I said, where all these infrastructure is maxed out, you really think you want to do this? And they just looked at me like I was from Mars. And they said, you know, plan for success, don't plan for failure. Get the hell out of here. In other words, this was the attitude, right? They weren't interested in hearing from the people who had built up. I was just one of them. This has happened to lots of people that, you know, they didn't want to hear about it. And so they brought in people. Doug Feith creates the, you know, the Office of Special Investigations, which basically, again, funnels Chalabi's information directly into the Office of the Vice President. You know, it's a, you know, which provides the pretext for us to go to war. You know, Marshall Billingsley, you know, another one of these guys. The system is full of them. These ideologues. They're ideologues, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're making a point that what were some of the things we're seeing are not exactly new under the
exactly right.
current administration. That speaking of which, so you know, Frank and his wife Sharon spent time in a lot of embassies over the years, and so Sharon would like to get your perception of that other instrument of national power, or diplomacy, and whatever other tools we have.
Yes.
You know, the famous dime, the informational, economic.
Yeah.
Because some of that will have to take over for the military, right? So.
Yeah, sure. So I can't speak for. I'm most familiar with the State Department footprint in the Gulf and the Middle East, right? And I witnessed over sort of my experience, which sort of, if you think of 1996 turns out to be a pretty important year. It's the year of the Khobar Towers, the attack on the American airfield at Dhahran. The Air Force barracks gets blown up. 19 service people are killed, and the result of this is that it creates there's a directive that gets put out by then Secretary of Defense William Perry which deals with something called force protection, right? So this sort of is the leading edge to what is going to turn our military installations and our embassies into armed fortresses, right? With 3 layers of security and guards of different derivations, and all of these buildings, and of course spending money to protect our diplomats. And I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't be doing all necessary spending the money to protect the people who are out there serving the country. But the downside of this sort of, again, this, I don't want to say it's an obsession, because I don't want to appear to say that I'm wanting to place Americans at needless risk. But the effect of placing us behind in these Fort Knox-like facilities, both military and civilian, is that you become less influential in the home country. You know, you have to make appointments to see your counterparts. You have a much less of a free interaction, which after all is what, like, the political officer in an embassy is supposed to do. The political officer in an embassy and his staff, they're supposed to actually be wandering around the place. They're supposed to be talking to people. They're supposed to be gathering information that is then used as the basis to write reporting cables, you know, up back to the home base in the State Department. And my perception is that it became a lot more difficult for the State Department to do its job, which then meant our diplomacy becomes a more sort of problematic instrument to be able to operationalize, right? And so my perception is that, as this is also, I should say, the diplomatic, and again, speaking only for the Persian Gulf and the Middle East, the diplomatic side of our toolkit gets de-emphasized at the same time that what is being increased, it's our military, right? And it's out of balance. There isn't a way to say that it is not out of balance in the Gulf and the Middle East. That the State Department basically outsources the administration of foreign policy to its CENTCOM, you know, and the CENTCOM sort of general ends up being the main American political figure in the region, as opposed to the collection of ambassadors. And so the system kind of gets turned on its head a little bit. And so a challenge for any administration, a new administration, is to try to do something about this. And I don't know how you solve this problem. I don't know how you you address this obvious asymmetry in the two departments, in which the Defense Department has 700 billion and the State Department has 70, right? You know, I mean, it's just the reality. There are more people in marching bands in the Defense Department than there are Foreign Service officers. It's some statistic like this, right? But it's an asymmetry that has to be addressed if you really want to be serious about your diplomacy. So my perception is that the State Department has really declined in relative importance for a variety of different reasons. But as I said, in the Gulf and the Middle East, its force protection and these new embassies was certainly part of that I witnessed, you know, up close and personal.
Well, fantastic. I think that was our last question. There are a few more questions, but obviously you stimulated a lot of interesting discussion. And we want to thank you, Professor James Russell, for your presentation today. And we also want to thank our audience. Please catch our next program on Tuesday, November 17th.